Okay, Dr. Alex asked me to actually introduce this session, so I'm only here to do that and also to listen. And it's a massive pleasure to introduce this. The two people who I admire enormously, and another one who I admire enormously virtually, whose chair is there, but she's with us through the internet ether. So I think we all know who Dr. Boulanger is, and we're here to celebrate her book. She's been an absolutely fabulous JRF and early career researcher with us in the faculty of Portuguese, and we very much appreciate what she's done. But today we're here to look at her and talk about her wonderful book, and we'll hear more about that in a minute. Obviously, we have behind us Professor Hilary Owen, who's actually one of our research fellows in the subfaculty of Portuguese and is a professor emeritus at the University of Manchester, and who is also, I'm extremely pleased to have this news book, is now old news, but is a fellow of the British Academy, Portuguese representative, which for many years we've required, and we now have in the very able presence of Hilary. And there's a particular pleasure for me in having with us today Dr. Alex Reza, who is one of our alumni and very much a star. And she told me not to linger too much on this, so I won't. I should be brief. But she has her own book coming out very, very soon with the OUP. The Students of Empire is currently called, and we all know at the last minute these titles change, but I think this is a really good title for the moment. Literary Journals and African Decolonization, which will be out later this year. She's a lecturer in Complicities at the University of Bristol, where she actually directs the BA program, which, as we all know, is probably a horrendous task that takes way too much of her time. So we're very pleased that she's with us here today. And she's also been a BBC AHRC New Generation Thinker, which produced Radio 3 programs. And we might have heard another Radio 3 program, which she was recently on, called Free Thinking. It was a podcast all about Amilcar Cabral. So she's very much more famous than we are, and she's with us here today. She's going to start the questioning, and we're going to interrogate it.
Maybe Hilary will actually start.
Oh, it's Hilary starting, so
Yes.
the other room. Sorry, so we're going to Hilary first. I don't know if we can hear Hilary at the moment.
Yeah, I think so. Can you?
Yes,
can hear
brilliant,
you, yes,
actually.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, no, I can hear you fine too. So that's great. All right, it's over to me. Is it the disembodied face being beamed in from the Peak District? Thank you very much for those really kind words, Philip. I'm absolutely delighted to have been asked to speak to Dorothee's excellent new book. I'm only really sorry I can't be there in person, but life has a way of intervening in the best laid plans. And it goes without saying that given my own past work on Lusophone Africa and literature, I was particularly happy to be invited and involved in seeing this book to publication with the Hispanic and Lusophone Cultures series with Legenda, which I'm involved with. I absolutely love the way Dorothee's opening sentence hits Roland Barthes straight between the eyes. Should I confess that I nearly punched the air when I read it? She starts by citing a 1998 essay by the Nigerian writer Odia Efemun. Drawing on Efemun, she reminds us that Barthes cannot have had the African writer in mind when he wrote The Death of the Author in 1967. Such a death would have been more likely to prove literal than symbolic in relation to African literature, where, and here I'm quoting Dorothee, several of the continent's most prominent writers were then either in exile, incarcerated, or had died violently. End of quote. She deploys Efemun then by way of warning us, and it's a warning that has only become more timely, sadly, in 2023, against, quote, killing off those who were ready to script their people into history. From there, Boulanger goes on to point out that from the 50s to the mid-70s, nearly all of the leading writers and intellectuals from Portugal's then colonies in Africa had undergone some form of violent, oppressive incarceration and/or exile. So fiction as history stakes out its territory by firmly exposing and displacing the luxury of 1960s structuralist and formalist hermeneutics as privileged critical epistemologies. In doing this, fiction as history represents then a very bold and courageous undertaking, and a much needed one. We're invited to look at novels which she tells us are, quote, they're not to be seen as self-contained works of art, but as aesthetic interventions possessing a transformative dimension, influencing, subverting, reinforcing, and challenging power relations, end of quote. In order to make good on this promise, Dorothée takes on the enormous task of bringing the Angolan literary fiction canon, all the way from the 1970s to the present, back into productive dialogue with colonial, nationalist, and post-independence histories. She does this without sacrificing the sophisticated textual analysis which these writers demand and deserve. And I think she scores an interesting and challenging absolute first by including in this process Sousa Jamba in a Lusophone corpus, although he's an Angolan diaspora writer who publishes in English and who provides a very obvious counter-narrative to the Marxist Geração da Utopia. In terms of its historical scope and its critical incisiveness, fiction as history is the worthy and probably the first real successor to the landmark work from 1997, Transculturation and Resistance in Lusophone African Narrative, by the late and much missed Phyllis Parrish from the University of Maryland. In this role, Dorothee's book will certainly become a mainstay on all our undergraduate reading lists. And it is, of course, the word resistance that stands out here as being common to both titles, Dorothee's subtitles, Resistance and Complicities in Angolan Postcolonial Literature. The juxtaposition of Parrish and Boulanger, then, opens up a defining field of inquiry for Angolan literary production. It invites us to analyse the discursive and political shifts that are entailed in pairing the repeated term resistance with transculturation in Phyllis Parrish's work and with complicities in Dorothée Boulanger's. I don't know whether Dorothée intended quite so direct a dialogue with Parrish or not, but it's certainly there for the taking. And where complicities are astutely foregrounded here as the inevitable shadow discourse of utopian resistance, we have a book which is not afraid to acknowledge contemporary critique of the MPLA, such as that which is undertaken by Lara Pawson in The Name of the People, Angola's Forgotten Massacre, and more recently by Margarida Cardoso in her 2022 documentary on the death of Sita Valls. Both of those works ask difficult questions about the dead and exiled author generations as themselves the authors of crimes. Food for our ongoing discussion then. What I want to do now, before I conclude, is to end on a more optimistic note by stating that the Legenda series is now fielding some excellent titles related to the Portuguese-speaking countries of Africa. This is undoubtedly a major coup for us. Dorothee's book is an important companion piece to read, along with Philip Rothwell's monograph, Pepper Taylor and the MPLA, and her willingness to focus on gender constitutes a significant response to Maria Tavares' pioneering work on women writers in No Country for Non-Conforming Women. It is not easy getting Lusophone African literary scholarship published in the English language. I know this because I have done it. Thank you, Legenda, for so successfully combining an insistence on both academic excellence and necessary inclusivity. And thank you so much, Dorothée, for helping us to maintain the Legenda momentum in relation to Lusophone Africa in this far-reaching and insightful manner. You've helped us to ensure that this particular trail continues to blaze very brightly for others in future. And now I want to hand you over to the author herself and to Dr. Alex Reza from Bristol to enter into their expert dialogue. Thank you both very much.
Thank you, Hilary.
So I think this means Dr. Reza.
Well, thanks. It's such a pleasure to be here to see so many people I haven't seen such a long time. And thank you, Dorothy, for asking me. We kind of agreed that what we do, especially because now we have a disembodied third member not in the room, that we kind of have a conversation rather than do a kind of formal. So I'm going to ask Dorothy's questions, but I'm not sure how you feel about this, Dorothy. But I'm going to go.
Fine.
What I wanted to do, I thought, given that I assume most people haven't read the book, and yet, even though it's going to be a mainstay on all our undergraduate curricula,
They're going to love me for it.
we could begin with some questions about kind of how you conceptualized the project and how you came to it, and then I have questions about kind of some of the questions of complicity and gender and things that you talk about, and then we could kind of open up depending on how people feel. I mean, I have millions of questions, so it might also be that we have to force me to stop or something, but we'll see. So maybe you could, because I know that you were working in Angola and living in Angola before you came to work on this book, so maybe you could say something about that experience and then how you came to conceptualize this project.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you so much, Hilary, for your very generous introduction. Thanks, Philip, for sharing, and you know, for being a very kind mentor these last 4 years. It's very nice actually to be able to launch a book kind of at the end of this, you know, Livre Lieu GRF thing, because I get to know everyone. Whereas, you know, 3 years ago, I wouldn't know who I would have invited to this lunch, and it's so nice to be able to share this with you today. So, to go back to your question, Alex, and thank you for coming. It's really nice to see you. To go back to your question, and I apologize for those who've heard this quite a few many times, but I
haven't heard it.
Okay. So I was living in Angola and I was working in Angola, and it was, so that was the early 2010s, and it was very surprising because they had the same president for 35 years. They had been outside of their civil war for about a decade. Prices were insane. People were living in terrible conditions. But there was a sense of, it was a very weird atmosphere. On the one hand, there was really a sense of optimism, like, you know, things are getting better, there's no more war, we have all this oil money. And on the other hand, there was a sense of, because things are better, we're not at all going to talk about all the negative things that happened to us. We're certainly not going to talk about politics. And so it was very awkward. These awkward silences about the country's situation, kind of past and present, was something that I wasn't used to and that I thought was very intriguing. And it's interesting because it kind of shifted right after I left, and that's when people started trying to protest. And, you know, in the wake of the Arab Springs, Angolans tried to get to the streets, take to the streets and contest their government, and they were never really able to do it. They would get immediately arrested. Everything was killed in the bud. And the fact that people were so scared of protesting said a lot about what, you know, people have called the dictatorship of silence. So the fact that there had been so much repression since independence, and of course since before independence during the anti-colonial war, that there really was a culture of silence and of people not voicing any kind of dissidence or contestation. So there was that atmosphere that I could very much feel on a kind of day-to-day basis in Angola. And then there were Angolan novels that I got to discover, as you do when you live in a country and you try to learn more about it through books. And I was really struck to see that those novels were actually extremely political and historical. And I think the first ones I read were probably Agualusa's Estação das Chuvas and Pepe Tela's O Cão e os Calundas. And so these very political discourse, but also critical discourse, thinking about the country's history, were troubling in the sense that they seem to be very much filling a void, right? And they seem to be quite openly discussing difficult matters about the genealogy of the elite, the culture of violence, that people in the street would certainly not be comfortable talking about. Of course, especially not to a foreigner, but even within Angolan circles.
And those were books that you were buying and reading or reading in Angola?
So they were actually lent to me by friends, and for the Agualusa book, I am pretty sure it wasn't bought in the country.
Anyway, sorry, carry on.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's actually important because that book was typically the kind of book that you would not find in Angola at that period, because its content was clearly problematic. And so you had this discrepancy, which made me think that maybe there was also something about writers that could explain why they felt like they could tackle this, that, you know, you couldn't find in the everyday person that I would meet in Lobito. So I was living in Lobito, not in Luanda. And it was that kind of prompted it. At first, I wanted to work on silence. I was thinking there are also lots of talk about the anti-colonial war in the novels. I had read Mayombe, but there wasn't much on the civil war, and it felt like it was a bit more of an uncomfortable topic. So at first I wanted to work on silence, and then the question of history and thinking about these novels as a historical source sort of took center stage as I realized how much some of these writers had been, you know, implicated, had participated in the anti-colonial struggle, or had been members of the MPLA. So it felt like they also had a very privileged point of view on political and historical matters, something that Philip has also looked at through Pepe Tela. So I really wanted to center on these questions.
And so in a sense, then you come to this project, you come as a historian. Is that how you saw your? I mean, that's what I'll maybe we'll talk about history and literature later. But I mean, I suppose the reason I'm asking that question is, so it's a book that looks at loads of different books. You have almost more than 20 novels by more than 8 writers, I think.
Yes.
And so for me, the question that I was initially starting with is kind of how do you choose? How did you choose which books? Because you say at one point that you kind of choose them because of their explicitly historical and political content, and that sense of explicitly historical and political context seems to be doing a lot of work. And sort of I wondered, were there books that you discounted because they weren't sufficiently explicit?
Yes, yes, there were books that weren't very clear in that kind of argument and might have had a lot of value in themselves, but that were not really, that I wasn't really able to sort of locate on the kind of weird resistance and complicities continuum, if you want. And so, I can think of a book by Arnaldo Santos, for example, Vento y Caçador, that I left on the side. And then actually, of course, as sometimes happen, things got too long, and so there's also an entire chapter on the 19th century that I ended up discarding from the thesis and from the book, and published elsewhere.
The sequel. Oh no.
Yeah, no, it's not.
The prequel.
But the way I chose, I mean, it's it's one of these things as well, and I mean, when you make a book and when you make a PhD, everything, you write your introduction at the end where everything needs to appear 100% completely consistent, and that was the plan, and which of course it was, but also there is a sense of there is so many relevant texts, and that's why I am putting in this book more text than I think most people put in monographs. Again, I wasn't really realizing this because I didn't do my PhD in a sort of literature or languages department, so I was doing it in history and no one told me anything, so I was like, of course I'll just add more. But to me, that made sense because what I was really trying to show was that these concerns were not like the obsession of one single writer or a specific momentum. I think it also says something about the identity of writers in Angola who have been permeated by this idea that writing books is political, that writing books makes a difference, and that nationalist generation, also inspired by the Angolenses of the late 19th century, where they're not so much writing books as writing, in newspapers and in magazines, etc. So something you know about more than I do. But I think that inspired the nationalist generation to sort of take their pens and write these political discourse. And one of the things I talk about, and it was also a point that was made by Patrick Chaval, is that because Portugal was a dictatorship, because there wasn't the possibility to really organize politically, basically people organized aesthetically, if you want. And Marisa Morman showed that for music, and Patrick Chaval for literature, that then literature became this way of constructing and disseminating a political discourse that was a political discourse critical of colonization. And the question I ask is, okay, that's great. And so when colonization ends and its independence, what do you write about? If you're a political writer, if your entire ethos is about contesting injustice and power imbalance and state violence, what do you do when it's independence and you are Minister of Information? Or, in charge of ports and railways? Yeah,
I think that's such an important question, this question of what happens to that tradition of critique and dissent after kind of the state. And I don't think many people work on that question, so I think that's very good. And I was asking you about why you pick these novels, not because I don't think they hang together. I think that it's very coherent. If it's an exercise in fiction, it's very well achieved. But I think that it's more that, I suppose, if you're thinking also about writing literary text as a form of aesthetic intervention, I was wondering whether, in thinking about which texts you felt counted as significant, as sufficiently political, whether you're kind of already determining the aesthetics that count as political in the process of choosing the books. And let's move on in a minute from this kind of question of how you set up the project, but that is a question that interests me.
No, I think that's really interesting. So there were some canonical texts that I absolutely wanted to revise. So there was also this sense of, some of these novels, and we're thinking about, most prominent writers like Pepetela have written texts that are considered absolutely essential if you want to learn about Angola. And I actually very much share that opinion, that they're so precious and say so much about the country. But I also sort of wanted to go back to them with a vengeance and take in systematically the kind of criticism that had already been hinted at by Philip and others about the gender politics that were really problematic. But there was also something else in the difficulty for some of these writers to also acknowledge their own social standpoint. So that was also something that I was trying to do in this book, is to put in conversation some, important counter-canonical Angolan novels that are now part of resistance literature, post-colonial literature, with texts from other Angolan authors who have never achieved that kind of prominence. And I think part of it has, so for some of them, it has to do with their lack of sort of political support. So
such as just some names.
So I'm thinking about Manuel dos Santos Lima, who was a first generation MPLA commander, and very early on left the movement because he was in disagreement with Agostinho Neto, lived in exile. That's produced really interesting novels, and you can tell aesthetically how they differ from the literature of Pepe Telago, Lução, Jackie, etc. They're much more vested in kind of African aesthetic that you will find in like Francophone novels, more like a Kuhuma or that kind of. So he was never big, and his books you can never find in Angola, but he was extremely critical and did it in a way that was very original from early on. So,
and do you think, sorry to interrupt, but if he never established a kind of literary reputation of the same scale as some of the others, you think that's because he was writing less to the party line?
I mean, so that's part of it. He also wrote less. So I mean, maybe if he, like Pivotella, published a book every 2 years, he would have established himself as a giant of Angolan literature with a really interesting story to tell. So I think that aspect is a real one, but there is clearly the sense that I don't think many people know who he is in Angola. He is not, whereas some Angolan writers are celebrities in their country, are considered as very prestigious public figures, at least have been. He is not one of them, and people have not engaged with his books, and his book is very little studied. His books are very little studied compared with others. But I'm also thinking about another writer like Boaventura Cardoso, who is well known, but is not well read at all. And I think his books are amazing and extremely rich, but I don't think they're as palatable to a kind of world literature audience.
Interesting. Why not?
Because they're 500-page novels that are much more, but they're also much more embedded in kind of, again, like African aesthetics, cosmologies, metaphors of rivers and spirits that I think, and it's not done in the kind of fashionable, magical realism way that Jackie or Pepe Tela would have mastered quite well. And so I think it just makes it harder to read. But it's extremely rich, and there really is here a sort of epistemological project of centering African cosmologies. And I thought that was also the kind of conversation that I wanted to bring up, is like Angolan literary aesthetics are also quite European, and the most famous Angolan writers are often from European descent, and I thought that was a problem, and it said something about the MPLA as well, the ruling party. So I was trying to sort of hold all of these things together, which was interesting at times.
Great. When you were saying, makes me think of the Cameroonian novelist Mongo Betty, who was in the 40s saying all these European publishers want us writers writing in French to write in this kind of surrealist aesthetic, because that's what their vision of African writing in French is, and we all have to be surrealists, and I just want to write it as it is, as he said it, I want to be a realist in his terms, but the publishers just won't publish it unless I put some kind of surrealism in there. And I wondered, in a sense, I mean, I think we should really talk about the main thing, which is kind of the MPLA and the novels, and we'll come on to that in a second. But I also was wondering, in that process of marketing and also of kind of mediation and publishing, whether you ever found in your research that there were publishers who were asking for particular kinds of texts, or editors suggesting that these writers change their stories or whatever, or that kind of work?
So
Intervention.
I haven't. That's not a line that I developed a lot. I very much took the novels as finished product, and I didn't really look at their genealogies, and I think that would be a whole project in itself. What I was more focused on is how writers censored themselves, and there are really interesting discussions among writers in the 1980s about what is it that we can say, and you can tell, you know. That's the great thing as well. We have writers who have been writing, you know, since the 70s and still writing in the early 2000s. So you could really tell how it evolves and the things they dare talk about, you know, now, but they would never have touched on 20 years or 30 years ago. So I was more interested in that kind of self-censorship and how their own understanding of political loyalty was playing out in the novels. In terms of the aesthetics, and I mean, I definitely do not think that they're deliberately catering for a kind of world audience. I mean, at least not all of them, maybe some. I think they were themselves trying to find some resources to tackle certain political issues and certain political problems in ways that were more sort of creative, but also enjoyable, if you want. The reality was so bleak in Angola, and has been for quite a while. I think there was this kind of necessity to find resources to make literature something that wasn't just, you know, a sort of catalog of misery, but also had ways of kind of inspiring readers and you know, making books, these kind of beautiful stories. So I think that's where they really had to use the imagination, or, you know, the African collective imagination, and dig deep to try to enchant Angola, if you want, at that time.
In the 50s, and in the 50s in particular, reading stuff that the younger Agustín Neto or Mariquín Centenares and people like that are writing about, what kinds of, how should the engaged writer write, those kinds of questions. And at that point, my sense at that moment was that they were kind of trying to respond to a Soviet sense of an opposition between socialist realism and formalism. And they were sort of saying, well, we're not decadents. We don't want to write as some of them put it, a kind of poetry of flowers, by which, I mean, some of them wrote really effective, Luanzi and Vieira wrote really effective poetry of flowers from prison, but a sense that, you know, there was some kind of, they felt an impetus to write texts that they felt were in conversation with what was really going on around them. But they also felt that part of the kind of anti-colonial project of freedom was also about not having to toe the line of prescribed aesthetics, and that part of their project was trying to find a way of writing that itself kind of models some forms of liberty that they were also aiming for in different social and political scales. And I remember then that kind of commitment to not prescribing the aesthetics that a writer should write in was quite strong. And I remember reading at some point the kind of was it in 1977 that Agustín Neto set up the Angolan Union of Writers, or some
35,
and in that he gives this kind of opening speech, and at that point he's kind of switches in his tone. He says, actually, we need to be realists now, and we need to kind of write the real, whatever that might mean. But I think that that's interesting, because it sounds that even despite that kind of presidential kind of party line, that writers nevertheless were trying to find their own kind of ways of writing about and around this new coalescing state structure.
Yeah, I think they probably felt, so I think the late 70s and the early 80s is probably when the writers were sort of most explicitly trying to be political in their literature and trying to address these questions of, you know, okay, what does it mean to be writing for the people? But I don't think it's a coincidence that there was less publications at that time as well. I think there were too many constraints. I think they were also a bit petrified in their own contradictions, you know, state violence getting worse and them sometimes being implicated in that. So, and I also wonder, you know, I think all these sort of commitments and declarations were very performative. I don't think they necessarily believed in that beyond, you know, just saying the right thing in the right meeting to get, you know what I mean? So this sense of very performative politics, or we're saying we're doing this, I don't think it meant a genuine commitment to do this. I think then once they were in front of, you know, their pen and paper trying to actually get something, what was said in these meetings, if you want, didn't make sense anymore. And I think that is why they were publishing less. I think that is why they were just finding themselves completely stuck, and trying to critique, but in ways that I find very unsatisfying. So, you know, trying to critique like the petty corruption of the country, rather than, you know, critiquing the regime that was actually pushing for this. These kinds of, you know, half-hearted attempts at keeping it real. And I think as the country sort of moves away from revolutionary politics, as the Cold War comes to an end, and as, you know, socialist utopia generally recedes, they feel they're much more liberated. And I think you see that the 90s is a time where you have like really interesting novels that are coming out, and it really feels like they were holding their breath as they were trying to debate this, never really found a way out, but then just conveniently in the 1990s felt like they didn't owe the regime anything anymore. The regime wasn't there for them, wasn't interested in literature, and so they were actually able to, you know, reconnect with a sense of aesthetics that made sense to them. And you have some very realistic novels, and you have others that are much more magical realist, or, you know, trying to tap on surrealist imaginaries, and I think that has to do with the fact that they were just not really interested in what the state had to say about their work anymore.
To go back a bit, and you said that when you sort of said you find some of the ways that these writers are writing kind of unsatisfactory in the kind of scale of their critique, that's kind of a big thing that you say in the book, that they were unwilling to evaluate kind of the writers that you look at are unwilling to consider themselves as part of a kind of structure of power, and that sort of later decades of literary criticism has also shied away from seeing those novelists as complicit. Maybe we'll talk in a second about what types of complicity that involves. But I wondered, first of all, the question of, okay, so on one hand, you're saying to history, read novels, and fiction is a kind of source that can be thought with as a way of understanding the past. And then on the other hand, you also want to read the novel, which I think is kind of, I agree with, as a kind of site of power, or as a kind of form of literary capital in some ways. But I wondered then, first of all, what is that? What is the nature of that kind of cultural capital? Why were these people writing in novel form? Why did they want to write novels rather than go to meetings or whatever? And then I want to ask about complicity, and about what, I mean, was Agustín Neto bringing these people up and sort of saying, you got to write like this? I mean, I'm parodying it, but what forms of pressure did the different writers live with?
Wait, what is your first question?
The first question is why the novel? Why
of course. You know, so before independence, there are very few novels. Generally, writers will write poetry, sometimes essays, short stories, and it's really after independence that form picks up. So there was already this kind of temporal thing that was interesting. It's like, suddenly, why do you need more pages? I think part of the answer is that they could. Russell Hamilton said it. There was also the sense that, you know, the anti-colonial struggle and all the kind of mess that is decolonization, you know, these writers being exiled or in prison, it was probably easier to write very short texts rather than, you know, decide to engage in the 300-page historical novel. So there is a very sort of pragmatic material aspect to that. But more importantly, I think that is because there had been this huge moment of mobilization that was a bit more lyrical, that was a bit more, you know, about trying poetically to sort of come together and really tap into these kind of emotional resources to build the Angolan nation through text. I think afterwards, writers were interested in exploring the evolution of their own standpoints and of, you know, their own ethical commitments, if you want, over time. And I think the novel responded to that capacity of, you know, thinking about a character sort of, you know, coming of age and then getting older, and it captured that kind of the complex, you know, moral dilemmas and compromisions that they were all going through at the time. So I think novels were the right medium to do these kind of complex, nuanced explorations. So I think there is that aspect. So A Geração da Utopia is, you know, the example of this kind of generation of people that you follow from their 20s to their 50s, and, you know, but I also think they wanted to explore the Angolan past, and so that is also a part of, you know, anti-colonial thinking, is we are not satisfied with the way the colonizer has shaped African history. We're not satisfied with the way European archives capture African agency and that whole period. So we want to revisit this, and we're going to revisit this by centering the experiences of African subjects. And so here again, a historical novel, which features, you know, quite prominently in Angolan literature, and therefore in my book, is something that they used to create another archive where, you know, they were the ones telling their country's history. And so I think that was also very much what interested me, is writers taking up again that role and that responsibility in a country where you didn't have a history department at independence. You had very few higher education institutions. Angola is still today terrible. I don't think there is one Angolan university in like the 100 best African universities. So higher education in Angola is abysmal, and there is a sense that they need to have other disciplines. The history is certainly not one of them. So people who work on, even Angolan people who work on Angolan history will generally be trained abroad and work abroad. So this difficult connection to history, which started with, you know, colonial censorship and colonial archives, continued with the MPLA that didn't open the archives, that was providing a very biased, very Manichaean narrative about the MPLA liberating the country against the bad colonizers. And so writers tried to sort of deconstruct this, tried to make this a bit more complicated and interesting. And one of the major ways in which they did it, one of the most interesting ways, I think, in which they did it, was to say, what about we stop looking at, you know, colonialism and we look a bit further back? And so when they started exploring the 17th century and started exploring slavery, and A Gloriosa Familia is the most famous example, showing how a very prominent Angolan family today in Luanda are, you know, descendants of slave traders who flourished in the 17th century. Showing this kind of longue durée formation of Angolan elite, I thought was, you know, very successfully done by Angolan writers, and showed very well how they could also sort of, you know, push debates in certain directions that were not necessarily very comfortable for the elite.
As well as kind of bring forward these counter histories from the kind of official state history. You talk about the well, you talk about the place of what you call redeeming masculinity in, or at least kind of writing masculinity for lots of the writers that you are talking about. So maybe we could talk about gender and about what that project of redeeming masculinity involved with some or of those writers, and then maybe we could talk about within writers.
Yes. So this book looks at 8 writers, none of them who are women, and that is complicated. Gender wasn't really featuring prominently when I started this project. I was really thinking, okay, history, you know, the question of silence, the Civil War, etc. And the more I was reading it, you know, it's one of these things when you start seeing them, you can't unsee them, and it was everywhere. And I realized I absolutely had to go with this, and I had to bring out the very problematic kind of gendered subtext of many of these novels. And especially the terrible ways in which these writers were writing about women. It was so bad. And what was hilarious, if you want, is that Angolan writers are very aware of certain inequalities. So, you know, of course, most of them are Marxist. Class is huge. So, you know, bourgeois is bad, etc. And so you really have this sense of looking at class relations in ways that are quite fun and quite, you know, show a great awareness. Same thing with race, especially because, you know, Angolan writers are a kind of very multiracial group. So all the tensions coming from legacies of racism, from very ambivalent status of white people in Angola, all of this is touched upon in novels, sometimes problematically, and it's interesting, but at least you have this awareness about that history of, you know, racist inequality in Angola. And when it comes to gender, you have none of this, which is amazing, because this way it is so obvious the second you see it, because it's like none of these writers have thought of how problematic, you know, or how biased they might be as men writing about this. And so when I started looking at this, I realized that, you know, all of the great characters were men, that it was incredible how female characters were systematically portrayed as passive, victim, very rarely had a narrative voice, absolutely no existence outside of, you know, the men or in their lives, etc. And that made me realize how much gender had been, you know, this kind of blind spot of nationalist politics, which I mean has been demonstrated before, obviously, and Hilary has been really good at showing, you know, how women writers were able to switch these nationalist conversations and give up these feminist perspectives. And so to some extent what I was doing is the other way around, is showing how these male writers failed at trying to critique the gender imbalance of power, or did it in a way where the MPLA and the kind of nationalist anti-colonial forces were always presented as being on the side of women versus, you know, colonial conservatives or African patriarchs. And nationalists were supposed to be feminists just because of their larger emancipatory agenda. But what that actually looked like was never materialized in the novels. So that kind of failed attempt at bringing a gender equality was, I thought, really interesting. And on the other hand, they were quite good at showing how violence, and sometimes, again, completely unconsciously, showing how violence was based on notions of masculinity and male power that were signs of almost the traumatic impact of violence in Angola. So how men had to embody very macho postures and had no kind of way of asserting their own importance, but by embodying dominance, by embodying some kind of violence that was supposed to, you know, show kind of successful display of agency.
I mean, I imagine you also didn't have a huge number of women novelists to choose from in that period, but I wonder, thinking about kind of print culture beyond the novel, whether, you know, I suppose sometimes I feel that the question of kind of silence is maybe best put in terms of divisions of labour, and to ask, therefore, where are the women? What are they doing? Are they doing other kinds of textual work, like printing or copying or editing or publishing, you know, or what? Or are they, I don't know whether they're sort of thinking beyond the novel, whether there are other women writing about those moments in different forms.
Yes, Philip is probably in a better position than I am to answer this. But yes, I mean, women have been writing poetry, and so we have lists of women poets since the 1950s, and they have continued. And Ana Paula is probably the most famous. But what is interesting is that, so it's not the case for Ana Paula Tavares, but some of these women are also known, again, through their association with men. So Eugenia Neto was the only woman who was part of the founding members of the Union of African Writers, of Angolan Writers, and she was the wife of Agostinho Neto, who was the president and very famous Angolan poet. If you think about, I think Ruth Lara is an important, very important figure, and has played a major part in, you know, organizing Lucio Lara's archive. So it's really that kind of work, the supportive work, right? But of course, she is, again, like on the sort of in the background, very much working in the background. There are some Angolan writers. I have written novels. I really don't think that many, a few, but none of them.
First one was 97.
Yes,
That's the one.
it's the Tonya, the novel, right? Yeah. So
Yes, that's it.
that's over 20 years after independence. So, and none of them has kind of achieved the status of these male writers. None of them have their work circulate or, you know, nominated for prizes. And yeah, so I very much focused on these men writers and trying to deconstruct their discourse, but it's true that it is an abysmal absence. And I don't feel like there has been a sort of mass, you know, a great change in this. There's some women writers, and they're interesting women writers from the diaspora, from the Angolan diaspora, but they're still very much, I feel, at the periphery of Angolan literature.
Let me ask you one last question, and then you can all think of your millions of questions that you've got to ask. I've got loads more questions, so no one should feel stressed. But I think I have to stop. Let me just, one last question, which is about Cabral, who you talk about a lot, and you kind of talk about the ways in which Cabral felt that the bourgeois intelligentsia were, in a sense, a kind of useful tool as part of a kind of broader struggle, but that they, I think the quotation that you kind of use is that they need to commit class suicide. And I kind of, I mean, and that they and in your account, I think is clear, they don't. But I suppose this is maybe more of a theoretical question, but what would they have had to do?
I think it's
sorry. This is
so what they should have done from my comfortable position as an academic in the global north. No, I mean, I think that the major problem for the answer is no. I mean, I think it's an important question because to some extent it's a question that we can all ask ourselves, and it's the problem of intellectuals, writers, academics, you know, kind of always locating themselves on the subaltern side of power, and so having this kind of, you know, lack of self-awareness about
rather than as powerful people.
Exactly. And so I think gender is a good example of this. You know, realizing that they had that kind of privilege, and that privilege came with certain stereotypes, and the fact that they were so willfully, you know, replicating these stereotypes in their prose, so that there was this kind of lack of humility. And I mean, to some extent, I understand the lack of humility. You know, you had to have that kind of hubris to say, yes, we're going to overthrow the Portuguese Empire, you know, with our text, we're going to change the world, we're going to take everything by storm. So I understand where it is coming from, and I admire this profoundly. And I mean, let us be very clear, I am critical of these novels, but because I think they're so important and they have so much to offer. And I think they're rich because they hold all of these contradictions together, which is why they're so enjoyable to read. But so I think the problem with the class suicide is that they remain stuck in certain ways of thinking. It has to do with gender, but it also has to do with the way in which they saw African societies and cultures as, you know, obstacles that needed to be sort of superseded and that needed to be dominated. So there was also a lack of understanding of African languages, African authorities, a very you know, some contempt for African elites who they considered had been happy to collaborate with, you know, Portuguese authorities, which again, like coming from, you know, urban mixed race men, was a bit rich. So I think it's that kind of lack of self-awareness about their own privilege, basically, that stuck, you know, that made, that kept them stuck in certain authoritarian, really, ways of thinking and seeing society, that eventually meant that they lacked the courage to, you know, speak truth to power when they actually could have, and when people were listening and when they were important and relevant. Too bad.
Questions.
Just gonna get my bottle of water. You also have some cans of water if you want to from Alex.
Driving the cans.
Thank you.
I don't think I've ever had a can.
Oh my god, you know, COVID has been horrific.
They're going to explode.
Well, it's just water if it does.
Make it through.
I don't know anything about, or very little about Angola. I know something about Angolan literature, not very much. Anyway, you've enlightened me tremendously. But there's one thing that I would like to know more about, which you haven't touched on, which was not so much the writers you're talking about, but your experience as a reader. I mean, how did you get hold of the text? You presumably didn't go into the National Library. Is there a National Library in Rwanda and order them? And how did you borrow them, or did you buy them from? Were they sent to you?
When I was living in Angola.
Yes.
Yes, it was. So sometimes it was friends who had them from abroad, but also if you went to the markets, you would have lots of old books that they would sell. So street sellers or market sellers, and you would have these really interesting market stalls with books. And they were, you know, like these old Uniões de Escritores Angolanos editions that were really beautiful. So I got quite a few from those places, but also there are some bookstores, and so you will find most of Capitelas, or, you know, these cannot, Luandino features always very prominently. So some of them you could find in stores, most of them I would say on the street. And then there were others that you had to find abroad. So it was, yeah, mixed methods.
And how did you know what you were looking for?
I never did. I mean, no, I didn't. Sometimes I bought terrible books, and
you may miss things altogether, or miss writers altogether.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not, I guess it's not impossible. I mean, as I didn't do my entire research in Angola, as I left the country, I was able to then engage with academic writing on, you know, Lusophone African literature, and I wasn't a pioneering scholar in this. That field had already been established for a few decades, so I was able to tell. But no, I don't think I can't say I haven't missed anything. I don't know. But what I wanted to do was definitely take some of the big names of Angolan literature and read them a bit differently, because I had the feeling that the previous implication of writers in the anti-colonial struggle had made them a bit too sympathetic to critics. And I had the feeling that most literary critics of Angola were a bit too deferential to writers. You know, literary critics never had an issue, many of them never had an issue traveling to Angola for their research in the 80s and 90s, when you wouldn't have any historian, anthropologist, policist that would be able to get a visa delivered. But they were friends with the writers, they were in these kind of intellectual circles, and so I feel like that, I think that kind of you know, push them to look at certain aspects of the novels more than others. And I very much wanted to write about the more uncomfortable aspects of these texts, which is why I also included many of, you know, the novels that are quite famous and well studied.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Can't wait to read it. Is there a space in these novels for, I mean, you touched on it, I think, a bit, but is there a space for imagining futures in these novels?
Yes, some of them do. Some of them do. Sometimes it's very metaphorical. Sometimes it's much more, you know, very much rooted in the everyday, and then it takes us to a very weird, very weird direction. I think I wouldn't say they've been as interested in sort of imagining the future as in deconstructing the past. There have been some really interesting kind of dystopian narratives, looking at, you know, sometimes the ends of the world, and sometimes just Luanda destroying itself, either in a gigantic fire or in a gigantic wave. So you've had these kinds of scenarios. But I think they're still relatively marginal. I think there is a sense that there is still so much to unpack about what actually happened in the country, or, you know, that it's it's not a dominant genre. So if you think about Afrofuturism, which has developed so much recently, Angolan writers don't really feature very prominently at that genre for the moment. Yeah, I wonder, it's at an interesting, it's at an interesting moment, I think, Angolan literature. I think they're trying to think about what is the next thing. They've been on such a, it's been so productive and so rich for 4 or 5 decades, and you can tell that it's slowing down now. And I think the whole relevance of literature in general to, you know, deliver a kind of important and sharp critique is sort of diminishing a bit. So we'll see where it goes. But for the moment, yeah, it hasn't really taken up too much, apart from a few exceptions, on the kind of imaginative or futuristic narratives.
I think we have in the front and in the back here.
What would you like historians to take from your book?
Give
me the clip notes version.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, yeah, as you know, I did my PhD in the history department, so that was very much and I mean, I don't think I changed the way they do history in that department. I think they thought I was very exotic, like, okay, that's great, you can have your degree, now go. But I think the thing is, I do think some historians, and especially historians of Africa, do read fiction. Yeah. But I don't think they acknowledge it, and I don't think they see it as a source. And you know, when I say fiction as history, and when I say fiction is historical source, I'm not saying it's the historical source. What I'm saying is we need a dialogue between fiction and other kind of historical narratives. And it's very weird because I think historians do that, they just never write about it. And so I think it's just about acknowledging that there is legitimacy in, you know, grounding, centering African experiences and African voices. Voices that are, you know, biased and limited and partial and, you know, coming from a specific standpoint. But I think it is worth exploring, just as you would any primary source, basically. So I would tell historians, stop pretending you don't do it and just, you know, and just make it work within the research generally, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So you kind of mentioned briefly like the connection or like the similarities with like francophone writers, and I was wondering if there was like other things that you came across or like unearthed, like either like connections or similarities or like dialogues between these Angolan writers and like other other like countries in Africa, other literatures in Africa, but also more like locally as well, or in exile, like that was going on. Sorry, that's a lot.
Yeah, I will not pretend that I have very relevant things to say about many of those. Now, one thing that struck me, for example, what I thought was super interesting is, so Pepe Tela has written lots of historical novels that I really like. And he's written a lot about Jinga and a lot about Luigi, which is, you know, really, I mean, the novels are great, especially Luigi. I really, and this is a massive book, but I really thought it was extremely rich and a very productive way of thinking about power, of thinking about the legitimacy of power. So I really enjoyed it. And I was thinking, you know, like Pepe Tela is really trying hard, like to be a bit less sexist than usual, etc. Like there was a, you know, a valid attempt. And then I read Neonda by Ivan Vera. And it was really interesting to sort of read a book written by women and, you know, doing that kind of revisiting of African figures of resistance or African female figures of power, and to see how she was writing women's power in Africa. And I have to say that stuck with me, and I absolutely adore that novel, Neonda. And I thought it would have been a shame, you know, to only stick to Pepe Tela's narratives about women, kings, and rulers, and not see this. So I think in terms of, yeah, being able to compare those narratives with African women writers is extremely productive. And And then, so the magical realism thing is interesting. And I have read quite a bit of, Latin American magical realism, and I thought it was really interesting to see how certain writers like Onjaki, like Pepetela, managed to sort of weave that very successfully in their novels in a way that, gets them a lot of public acclaim, and how others who actually center the invisible in more obvious ways are never really picked up by the critique. So again, I thought that says something about how do you kind of center, African modes of writing or narrating, if you want, in how you read novels. Voilà.
Can I just pick up on this point about dialogue between history and literature? Because I think in some ways you might say that, historically inclined literary critics do that, in the sense that if you are, if you take seriously the idea that literary forms of writing are important sites of writing, important forms of writing, but are also interested in the kind of historical, in the societies in which they kind of are in dialogue and were produced in, and so on, then I wonder if maybe the kind of follow-up kind of sort of opposite question is, what do you want literary critics, perhaps particularly ones that are already interested in history and aren't just kind of textualist, formalist, to take from your book?
I mean, I do realize that these debates have like a very long history, and I'm not inventing anything about fiction and history. And I mean, there are lots of things to say about, Balzac as a historian, etc. So I'm really not trying to reinvent the wheel on this. But what I was interested in is to look closely at that generation of writers and where they stood in Angolan society or Angolan history, and what that implied for their type of writing. So in the same way that I think, because of the standpoint of these writers, they need to be taken into account by historians for looking at Angola, in exactly the same way, I think that literary critiques have. So basically, I'm not very much the death of the author kind of person. You haven't go there. Yeah, I actually think that the standpoint of these writers needs to be acknowledged by literary critics. The fact that they're men, the fact that they're urban, the fact that many of them were, educated more or less at the periphery of colonial society, if not, right at the middle of colonial society. So I think it's just that, that interplay between people's standpoints and their agendas. And that's the other thing, are we supposed to be reading novels as if they're political programs? Of course we're not, but on the other hand, these writers are trying to make an intervention, a very deliberate one. And so I don't think it is betraying literature to say that it's political. And so it's and maybe also, being French, and you have even neater sort of disciplinary divisions and very contemptuous discourse from each discipline against the other. Like, I was very frustrated. I'm speaking under the control of Eddie's here, but so I very much wanted to say yes, but if you're looking at African literature in this context, it makes actually no sense to be dividing them at all. Which again doesn't mean to take at face value any of the things that these novels are doing. But so I think it's just a very sort of grounded literary analysis, which is you do field work in the country, you really try to get those texts within their wider sort of context of production, I guess.
I think the really difficult thing, the thing I find difficult is bridging, in a way, kind of exterior analysis of the text with its kind of conditions of production and the context in which it was published or read. That's the other thing, read in different ways at different points, and an interior, trying to bring that exterior and interior focus together. And I think form can be one way of, attention to form can be one way of kind of doing that, in as much as form is also social. And that's why I suppose that in that question of the novel, I think, certainly English, and maybe maybe across English, French and Portuguese language, post-colonial studies have placed a real emphasis on the novel as this kind of sort of privileged form for articulating its particularly national consciousness. And different reasons have been given for that kind of emphasis on the novel. Some particular claims for the sort of elasticity or the whatever accordionizing functions of some kind of 20th century novels have been put forward. But it's interesting because in, I don't know, thinking, for example, about Guinea, which is a country that I work on, there aren't that many novels. I mean, there are a couple of novelists, but the kind of that proliferation of novel writing that I think your book really richly brings forward is not there in other countries. That's partly because of things like the logistical things that you've already mentioned about how the time needed to, the paper needed to print novels, that all the kind of infrastructure, but also maybe because there's less kind of rhetorical commitment to the novel as the right form to kind of to write in. And so even thinking about Cabral and in Guinea-Bissau, you know, he was not very interested in the end, is not very interested in novels or literature, and was much more interested in mass media. And so there was much more emphasis or kind of resources made available to people who wanted to print or to broadcast or to make films, is the other thing. And so I suppose there's still this question of sort of what work, even if it's a kind of just imaginative work, is that kind of, I mean, we're not going to resolve this now, but I mean, it kind of is that novel, that novel form doing for those writers in Angola? What doors does it unlock? What kind of status does it bequeath to be a novelist rather than, I don't know, a filmmaker or a broadcaster or a journalist or a poet or a whatever?
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Playwrights.
Some of them are not just novelists, I guess. You know, many of them have been journalists as well, and they wrote about Angola and have been, you know, some of them painters. But you're right. I don't know. I wonder to what extent it, you know, it had to do with the fact that they were so institutionalized in Angola, and so maybe felt that, you know, they had this responsibility for producing these major pieces that would then sort of ground Angolan culture. Whereas maybe in Guinea, you know, it was always much more from the little I understand, maybe yeah, didn't have that kind of institutional backup or prestige. I don't know. I really don't.
Well, that's 19th century notions of nationhood, isn't it? That they're taking in from Europe in Angola. They're really, really inflected in that. I mean, their model is Europe. And in Guinea, it's never Europe.
When you think about a novel like Ousmane Sembène's Le Bout de Bois de Dieu, God's Bits of Woods, which is a Senegalese novel, is that hand? Which published in 1961, and which is, I think, a text that historians really like because it's a kind of fictionalized account of a train strike.
I used it in history classes.
Yeah, I really understand where you would, but because it's a fictionalized version of a real strike that happened in 1947. And there's all this, there's a kind of Frederick Cooper piece kind of meant sort of detailing the ways in which Sembène's fiction sort of diverts, is not true. And, you know, all these things that characters do that aren't true in the text. And that's what I mean by kind of, I think that we need to find ways of doing that, kind of using literary texts in whatever ways you want to use them as sources or not, but not sort of using their fictionality as a kind of rod to sort of beat them with in a way. That's, I think, it's tricky because
it is because, like, Terence Ranger loved Nanda.
Yeah,
you know, he said, I mean, Yvonne Vera tells that very well. You know, he asked to meet her, and she's like, "Oh, you know, like that white historian is going to tell me I got it all wrong. I'm like, not interested."
Yeah,
and no, he was actually, you know,
yeah,
he was in awe of how she had managed to sort of
Yeah.
capture something of, you know, the magic. And so I don't know if I don't know if we need to be more imaginative in the ways we understand these texts. The problem then is the romanticization of it.
yeah.
So
There is some place for anyway. Let's ask Simon's question and then.
I mean, just what you're saying, I think it's so true about the obsession with trying to figure out what's right and what's wrong in something is often the way that historians respond to things, and that happens with Mendes Pinto very famously, where almost everything that's written about Mendes Pinto is trying to say, is it true or is it false? And I kind of don't really care about that, because in a sense it still exists as a historical thing in the world doing things, whether it's true or it's false, you know, and there's a kind of denial of that fiction is still real in that people read it and think about it and don't necessarily know whether it's true or false. So my question is a bit going back to what Alex was saying about explicitness and about kind of the ways in which these novels do gain traction in the world, and that is it kind of citation? So is it there's something actual quotes from the text that then somehow synthesize something? Is it around characters, that characters embody something and the character then becomes the buying word from something, which is something that happens a lot. The way in which, fictional characters, have a life of their own, and people know about them even if they've not read the text. Or are there other ways in which these kind of texts have a historical age, the ways in which they have their historical agency that actually maybe have nothing to do with the novel as a whole, but actually have to do with the ways in which they kind of move, or is it critics or whatever. I guess I'm asking a little bit more about the sort of reception end, but not in a sort of more in a historical or a kind of sociological way in which those things gain traction.
No, it's a tough one, obviously, but I always wonder if it has to do with the kind of historical ambitions that I think many of these writers have. And if you look at the texts that have been like prized recently, if you think about Onde é que os transparentes, if you think about Angolan with either a teoria do esquecimento or a Rainha Ginga, I think, and maybe that's very unfair, but I wonder to what extent there isn't a sense of sort of capturing a whole country in a book kind of thing. And I think for people who know nothing about these countries, and Angola is not even one of the African countries that is kind of known or on the cultural map of anything, I wonder to what extent people feel like they have sort of caught up with everything by reading. I don't know. I mean, I'm ashamed to say that it's not a very academic thing to say, but you know what I mean? I wonder to what extent these novels, because they're well constructed, they have a very clear argument, and are able to kind of bring in successfully some sort of social complexity. They're very satisfying to the reader because then it feels like they figure it out. Which is problematic, but I think there is something of that in the success of these novels. They're very much trying to sort of, brush Angola in one stroke kind of thing.
I always think that Angolan is really good at title, and like the titles always end up having this thing where they seem to be a key to something. And interestingly, the kind of different novels work differently with that, and whether it's a kind of person who's being foregrounded, or these kind of allegorical or kind of I don't really like allegory and fable as being things that are also very formalist in their kind of conception. And actually academic study has a kind of Russian prop element to those things, so I don't like imposing them, but they often work in that way. And is it's imagining the kinds of structures that are used as a way of kind of trying to get a sense of having a key, or how does a novel imagine itself gaining traction. And the big in France in the 20th century, constantly thinking, oh, the character is dead, the plot is dead, thinking of these elements that were in the 19th century novel but were somehow problematic, or wanting to kind of go against, but actually are quite effective ways in which 19th century novels moved, and moved in ways when they weren't being read in their entirety. I think of Robert, who created these kind of characters, Zola. So it's just I was thinking about that, the novel form and what it represents for people.
I think Agualusa has a tone that I think people enjoy. I think he has this,
and translators.
No, absolutely. But I think he's kind of good at giving a very sort of playful tone to novels that are also capturing things that are quite bleak. So it doesn't make us feel bad, but still it makes us feel smart and like we're committed readers to, issues of slavery and so I think he's good at, I enjoy reading him. Like I do, but I think there is an element of that to it. He's good at playing it, and it's the tone that is also the postmodern trick. So you mentioned titles. He's good at titles, and then he got a book that was translated with another title, which is like O Vendedor de Passado, which was translated as the Book of Chameleons, and then he published a book called O Livro dos Camaleões, and he's like, translate that. So he's also very good at having that kind of meta thing about literature and Angola, and he plays his cards. But I think Agualusa is very much the, and again, like he says it himself, but he's very much almost a caricature of the professional writer in that sense, you know, ticking all the right boxes, doing everything. The other ones are, I think, a bit more genuine in their approach to world literature.
There are 2 more questions. Do we have time or not?
Yes.
I got a chat. A question.
That was rougher. So what's the challenge?
Okay, so the question from the chat is from Hannah Grayson, and it's: did you trace any interesting cases of intertextuality or cross-referencing between the novels/novelists you looked at? Any formal tropes or tendencies you saw repeated or networked?
Should we take, who was it? Yeah.
It was just mainly a comment on what they were saying in the sense of, you know, these novels, when you read it, you feel like you've caught up. Okay, like and now I know what's happening. And it really speaks to a sense that these writers aren't writing for Angolans. So like they're writing particularly for somebody that, you know, is outside of like the NOAA. And so I think that's quite interesting. It's also thinking about the ways in which these novels kind of, you know, circulate. They're circulating particularly, and as you're saying, like the kind of idea of like, what's the appeal for world literature as well, you know, like how are these writers kind of placing themselves within, you know, in a way to make themselves appealing for a world literary crowd, to make themselves appealing for translation. In many ways, it seems to me the kind of author that is not very appealing for translation because it's difficult linguistically. And so again, I think there is a definite sense that these works are circulating very consciously, being written very consciously, being circulating very consciously in a world literary system that is geared towards like outside of Angola, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think there are different things. I think that's definitely part of what is happening. Not all of them. Like I don't think they're right thinking, okay, you know, what do I need to, you know, to get that prize? I think that would be unfair. I also think some of them write. I do think they write in a kind of archival mode. I mean, I do think they also want these texts to stay and to speak also to maybe future generations of Angolans. So there isn't a great readership in Angola. Like it doesn't, which doesn't mean that they're not specifically tailoring this to a global audience with everything that it, you know, means in terms of their own careers and therefore living. But I also think there is a sense that even if they were writing a book specifically tailored for Angolan audiences, it might not necessarily pick up at this stage because readership is very poor and there are very clear reasons for this. So there is also a sense of writing this for next generations. If, you know, someday some government kind of takes formal education seriously in that country, then it would make sense. So I think it's not necessarily one or the other. I think there is a temporal thing as well. Now, of course, if you ask them, they will say that they never have their audience in mind when they write and they only write for themselves. So that kind of settles it. Should I answer this the last? Yeah. So about the tropes and the kind of intertextuality, I don't have time to go into detail, but yeah, tons. And they're quite good at sort of speaking to one another. And well, actually, we co-wrote an article with Andre talking about how Njaki rewrites Wandino and how there's an interesting sort of intergenerational dialogue going on around notions of boyhood in Luanda from Wandino to Njaki. So definitely. But also, again, Agualusa has been good at sort of taking characters from Pepetela, inserting them in his own novel, so having these kinds of little nods. So yes, this intertextuality exists, and also even beyond the literary aspects of it. Or there's also this trope that comes back all the time where Luanda is a city where anything can happen. So this is something that you'll find in many novels. And finally, it's not intertextuality, but it's really interesting to look at how various novels talk about the same historical events, because you have very different perspectives, very contradictory ones, and that's really great to, you know, keep history open and think about history as these kind of challenges and competing narratives about the past.
Well, thank you very much for a marvelous discussion on a marvelous book. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming. thanks everyone to those who attended online. Appreciate it. And I think this is being recorded, so it will probably be available somewhere at some point. That's what I'm doing.